So if the question is just, hey, do you want to have sex with me? Then that's one thing. But that's never really the question. The question is always, do you love me? Do you want me? Do you desire me? Am I good enough for you? And so the more of those questions we're trying to get answered through sex, the harder it is to ask.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Let's be honest here. Initiating sex is not easy at all. We want the other person to take charge and initiate, right? We worry how we're going to be received. There's also so much of ourselves wrapped up in what it means to initiate or not initiate sex. And past experiences tend to influence our reluctance to initiate as well. Yet, the reality is, if one of you doesn't initiate sex, sex is never going to happen in your relationship. So, why is initiating sex so hard? What are some common reasons why people, me included, struggle to initiate sex sometimes? How do we get better at this very intimate act of bidding for sexual connection? I've been pondering these questions lately, and I'm grateful to meet up with James Christensen, a licensed marriage and family therapist from Roseville, California. You'll quickly find out that he has a brilliant, sharp mind and quickly cuts right to the heart of the matter. And there are 3 more reasons why I really like James. He served in the Air Force as a helicopter pilot and has lots of incredible stories. Second, when compared to his combat training and scary adrenaline-pumping experiences, he realized that building an intimate marriage and raising a family required more guts and courage than all that military training combined. So, he decided to retire from the military to become a therapist to help other couples have strong and intimate marriages. And reason number 3 I like him? He also happens to be my cousin. In this episode, we're going to talk about what's at the heart of initiating sex, because it gets a lot deeper than what you're probably thinking. And by the end of this episode, hopefully you'll take more courageous action to cherish your spouse more than before. We recently hit a major milestone with this podcast. Can we get some applause here? Thank you. We've hit over 1 million downloads. Can you celebrate with me? This is fantastic. Over 1 million downloads of the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I didn't think this was possible. Can you believe it? Anyway, this would not have been possible without your support. And thank you for sharing this podcast with your married friends. And thank you for those that leave a review on Apple Podcasts. I'm grateful to this person that left a review recently on Apple Podcasts. She says, "My husband and I are newly married, and Intimately Us was recommended by a friend, and we will be forever grateful. Through the app, I came across the podcast, and I love that he talks about topics usually left in the dark. I've learned so much." That was a great review. Thank you again. If you'll please take a moment to leave a review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, and when you hear me read your review on the air, email me at support@getyourmarriageon.com, and I will send you a gift in the mail as a way of saying thank you for helping strengthen marriages everywhere by spreading the good news. I also want to mention that we only have 1 spot left for a couple to join us for our upcoming retreat in March. There's just 1 spot left. If you've been on the fence, act now. The retreat is only 5 weeks away, and this is ideal for couples that are looking for ways to improve the intimacy in their marriage in a really fun, supportive, and relaxing setting. You'll find all of those details on my website at getyourmarriageon.com and then click on retreat. We're about halfway through the 14 Days of Sextimacy Challenge right now, which culminates next week Wednesday on Valentine's Day. Challenges like these are designed to motivate you to step a little more out of your comfort zone, because that's where the growth happens. I hope you've been really embracing that and enjoying a lot of growth in your relationships. Speaking of which, I also want to mention that we've had a very positive response to our DIY boudoir photography kit. And if you haven't heard, it's a box delivered to you with your choice of high-quality lingerie and a bunch of supplies to make it easier for you to create your own at-home boudoir photos. This kit includes tastefully drawn posing guides, a phone stand, a remote to make it easier to take your own photos, a scarf, perfume, body glitter, and a few other surprises that make this a really memorable experience. For these details, check out our show notes below or check out everyloveintimates.com. Now, let's talk about how to initiate sex like a pro. James, my man, welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
I am so excited to be here, Dan.
I've been looking forward to this episode for a long time. We've been talking about it, we've been planning it. And one thing I want people to know about you is you're an Air Force pilot turned marriage therapist. So I want to hear a fun story from your Air Force days.
Let's see, I was 5 years into my career. And so I'm at my second assignment. I was flying helicopters in Washington, D.C. And as you can imagine, Washington, D.C. has so many rules about where you can fly and where you can't. And so as Air Force helicopters, we were allowed to fly in most of the places, but not all of the places. And one of the places was Camp David, the president's vacation home up north of D.C. And if the president was there, you weren't allowed within like 10 miles. Like there was a huge ring about it. And if the president wasn't there, you could get a lot closer. And so there's this document called the NOTAMs, and you're supposed to check the NOTAMs before you go fly. And you look them up on the computer, and there's like 50 pages of like text written in all caps, and it's impossible to read. The issue was that I didn't really know how to read the NOTAMs, and I was too afraid to ask for guidance because I was one of the more senior pilots. I was supposed to know what I was doing. And here I'm like, I don't know how to tell if Camp David is open or not. And so I printed out the NOTAMs that day, and I looked through them, but I didn't really know what I was looking for. And my flight plan had been changed at the last moment. So I was supposed to be going south. And then at the last moment, they're like, hey, there's a new co-pilot. He needs a tour, and he needs to see the sites up north of the city, which includes Camp David. And so I'm like, oh, sure, yeah, I'll take him up north. And, this thought comes in the back of my mind. I'm not really sure whether the president's at Camp David or not, but he's not usually at Camp David. And so I just figure I'll go for it. And so now you already know where this is going. So hey, look out your door down there. That's Camp David. And about 3 minutes later, I see another helicopter in the air that's chasing us away. And so this is the president's security helicopter that are like, you should not be here. You are in so much trouble. And the sinking feeling comes in my heart. Oh my gosh, I'm going to lose
Off
my
with
wings.
his head.
Like, but no, I mean, you're laughing, but like, it's such a big deal. Like the Secret Service is after you. I mean, I thought it might be the last time I ever fly. And so, I radio home and I'm like, what should I do? And they're like, just come home right now. And I'm like, okay. And so I'm like, the helicopter, the Huey is not a fast helicopter. So, we're flying home for like an hour with like this dread of like, what's going to happen to me? And in the end, I mean, my commander protected me. We looked into the cause. There's a whole error chain of why this happened. So he just put me in charge. He's like, James, just make sure that this never happens to anybody else, because it could have been someone else. I mean, obviously you were the one who did the stupid thing, but it could have been someone else. And so we had to kind of put a procedure in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. But if I look at my own error chain, if I would have been willing to ask the stupid question, if I would have had the courage to ask, then I would have known how to read the NOTAMs and find out whether the president was at Camp David or not.
I like that. Too afraid to ask, or the courage to ask, which I think is a great segue into what we want to talk about today, which is initiating sex, which takes a lot of courage to ask. And I bet just about everyone listening to this can raise their hand that they could all use some help, in the initiating sex department, because it's kind of really scary. But I'm just curious, have you ever had a time when you initiated sex, but it was like a total fail? Like it was a mess up?
Yeah. So I'm high desire in my relationship. And so there's probably been about 10,000 times like that, just like, so I have kind of gotten to the point where that's okay. I don't even really see it as a failure, because I see it as a success if I presented myself well in the interaction. So like the way I evaluate myself is, do I have something good to offer, and did I offer it well? And then, my wife's response is more about her than about me. And so let's just say it took me a long time to figure that out, but that is kind of how I see it now.
Gotcha. So through coaching, I've come to know about this couple where he is deathly afraid to initiate sex, but he's also the higher desire spouse in their marriage. And his wife lays next to him in bed, and she knows that's kind of what's on his mind, yet he won't do anything about it. And I think some of us can relate to that too. Why is it so scary to ask for sex?
Whenever we're asking a question like that, it touches on this idea of, am I good enough? Am I acceptable? Am I loved? Am I desired? And so whenever we're touching on that idea, we feel so vulnerable because we're giving so much power to the other person. So if If the question is just, hey, do you want to have sex with me? Then that's one thing, but that's never really the question. The question is always, do you love me? Do you want me? Do you desire me? Am I good enough for you? Is it okay for me to be here? Like, is it even okay for me to be me? Like, that's what the real question is. And so the more of those questions we're trying to get answered through sex, the harder it is to ask. I think we have this survival instinct that comes from childhood, where once upon a time I was, 2 feet tall and I relied on my parents for survival. And it wasn't just physical survival. Yes, I needed food, clothing, shelter, protection from my parents, but I also needed love and I needed tenderness and I needed to be cherished and cared for. And I have this hardwiring in my body that says, you need to make sure that your parents care about you. You need to make sure that you're important to them and you need to make sure that they love you. And you also need to never do anything that might put that into question. So as a kid, because my survival depends on it, my body's hardwired to kind of encourage me to take care of that survival relationship. Now, fast forward 20 years later, now I'm an adult, I'm married. Those instincts don't go away. They just kind of transfer into marriage. And so anything that might disrupt the marriage relationship feels like a survival problem to me. So if I'm in a marriage where if I ask for sex, my wife might get upset about it, then my body is going to tell me, don't do that. That's not okay because that might threaten your survival. And so for me, that feels like this dull pain in my chest. Well, it's not always dull. Sometimes it's pretty intense, but it's like this very uncomfortable feeling in my chest here. And it's like this warning, do not, don't rock the boat. Don't tip over the apple cart. Don't ask for sex. Because, if she wanted sex, she would be having sex right now. And so if you're going to ask, you're going to open yourself up to this situation where you're vulnerable and where you've showed that you rely on her in a way that doesn't feel comfortable.
Yeah. It's kind of like that. What we learn to adapt as a child becomes maladaptive as we carry it into adulthood. There, it's that.
Absolutely.
No, right. Okay, so that makes sense. What are some other reasons why people struggle with initiating sex?
It takes a lot of courage to put yourself in a position where you might get rejected.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so even if, like, let's say I initiate, and even if my wife accepts the initiation, then she might not be as enthusiastic about it as I'd hoped. And that still feels like rejection. So I want to not just be accepted, I want to be desired, and I want enthusiasm, and I want passion. Now, none of those things are in my control, but sometimes if I ask for something and don't get it, then I'm going to feel like it's because I'm not good enough. And it feels just like some sort of judgment about me or something that's wrong with me. And once again, that comes back to like this survival level problem where if I'm not good enough, who's going to take care of me?
Gotcha. How about sexual dysfunction and things like that interfering with your desire to initiate? What do you see there?
I see that especially for men with sexual dysfunction, that really ties into the idea that I'm not good enough. Why wouldn't anyone want me? And why would I kind of expose myself to this embarrassment?
Right.
Whereas, as a man, let's say if you have erectile dysfunction, you still have, the other 99% of your body that can still be a really good lover. But most men with erectile dysfunction are going to just avoid the embarrassment of putting themselves in that position. And then that anxiety, of course, makes the condition worse.
Gotcha. So what do you do about it?
Well, this is a tough situation because the solution is courage. And the only way to get more courage is to be courageous. And so it's like if I want to bench 300 pounds, I don't start by benching 300 pounds. I start by benching 100 pounds and I work my way up. And so I need to find ways to practice being courageous in my marriage. Sometimes I work with couples who are working with a person who struggles with a lot of conflict avoidance. I will challenge them. I will say, I want you to propose, 5 things to your partner this week, and I want you to get 5 no's. And if they say yes, that doesn't count. You have to start over. And so start making propositions that are so ridiculous that no is the most likely outcome, because I want you to feel okay asking for something and having no be the answer.
Gotcha. And they get okay with no's, right?
Well, it's not that easy, but it does help. And so
Yeah.
it's getting your body used to asking a question and having no be the answer. And just getting used to the idea that I don't need you to tell me yes. I just want you to tell me yes. But my survival is not at stake.
It reminds me of a guy who had I don't know what it's called, but always washing his hands, kind of a fear of germs
OCD.
or whatever. Yeah. And the therapist takes his own hand and wipes it on the bottom of his shoe, shakes the guy's hand and says, now don't
Mhm.
wash for a half hour. The guy's freaking out, like, don't wash my
Yeah.
hands for a half hour, right? He had to go home and everything, but like, he got over it. Like,
It's called exposure therapy, and
yeah,
so
yeah,
that's
yeah.
exactly the same.
Uh-huh.
So I've also worked with clients in that situation, and um, basically, what you're doing is you're prescribing counter instinctive behavior. So if my instinct is to not ask, the solution is to do what I feel like not doing. So if my body is warning me and saying danger, 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 don't ask for sex because your partner might not be happy about that or might not say yes, what I need to do is I need to practice doing what makes sense from a more adult perspective instead of a child perspective. And so I'm going to say,
Ah,
okay, this is an instinct that comes from childhood when I was a tiny little vulnerable thing and I needed someone to protect me. But now I'm grown up and I don't need that protection anymore. I don't really need anything from my partner. I just want things. And so I can ask for things and it's okay if no is the answer. And it's better for me to be honest about it because it's actually more kind and loving to present myself honestly to my partner. So if I'm lying in bed and I want sex, but I don't say anything about it, there's a little bit of deception there. There's a little bit
right.
of you know what? I'm so afraid of you that I'm just going to kind of pretend to not want what I really do want. And obviously there's a balance. I mean, if I go around and tell my wife everything I want every 5 minutes, that gets really annoying.
Mhm.
But if I go to the other extreme and I don't ever talk about what I want, that's not ideal either.
Mm-mm. So that sounds really good in theory. How do you practice that on a regular basis? Like, how do you calm yourself down enough to be able to think that clearly in the moment? Like what you just described. I'm not a child anymore. I'm an adult. This is something I want, not something I need for my survival. Like, that sounds so good to tell myself, but in the moment, doesn't come so readily.
So I have a few tools that I use. I use a lot of breath work. So my favorite is just my go-to technique is I'm just going to take a deep breath in through my nose like this. So it's a few things. It's a noisy breath.
Uh
So
huh.
I'm making noise. I breathe in noisily. I breathe out noisily. I toss my head back when I breathe in,
Uh
and I
huh.
close my eyes. And I also take my arms are usually crossed in front of my body because this is a protect, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm going to take my arms out to my side, toss my head back, breathe in deep through my nose. And so each of those things is a counter instinctive behavior because if I'm in danger, what am I going to do? Like physical danger, I'm going to breathe quietly.
Uh huh.
I'm going to protect my body with my arms. I'm going to protect my neck with my chin,
Uh huh.
and I'm not going to do any of those. I'm not going to close my eyes. So those four things are all counter instinctive behaviors. So those are all calming. And so if I can do that 3 or 4 times, my body gets a signal that says, actually, you are in a safe position because you never would have done those four things if you were not in a safe place.
Got it.
So that's one way. The other way is I really like turning into my body and saying, what is my body telling me right now? Because we like to talk about thoughts and feelings. And I kind of think that most thoughts and feelings are just made up and not very real and not very useful, as opposed to what's happening in my body feels the most real to me.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm anxious about my marriage, then I'll feel it in my chest, sometimes in my stomach, usually in my chest. And so what I'll do is I say, well, my body is experiencing something unpleasant. I'm going to take care of my body. And so this is a huge shift for me because for the first 20 years of my marriage, when I was anxious, it was my wife's fault. Like that's just
Right.
the way it was. It was her
Always.
fault and she needed to fix it. And that worked really well, as you can imagine. Like she totally fixed it every time, right? No, she didn't. So so what I do now is I'm like, okay, my body's experiencing something. Well, okay, let me tell you the McDonald's story. So
Yeah, I want to hear it.
we're up at Tahoe skiing over, during Christmas break. And so I go out and I get McDonald's breakfast for the family. So I get McMuffins for everybody. And I didn't ask my wife what she wanted. I just kind of guessed her, whatever. I didn't read the notems, right?
Uh huh.
So here we go. Um,
Too afraid to
so
ask, probably.
I'm too afraid to ask. It, I mean, that's not really that
I'm
important,
just
but
kidding.
I bring back, she just woken up and she was in a bad mood. And I bring her McMuffin and she gets a little upset about it. She's like, I don't like McMuffins. I like this other thing. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, I mean, first of all, she could have been nicer about it. Yes, absolutely. It wasn't like she was yelling at me. I mean, she wasn't like that mean. She was
Uh
just
huh.
a little grumpy at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And my body exploded as if I died. Like my chest felt so much intense pain. I was like, God, what is happening here? And so it obviously was not proportionate to the amount of risk that I was facing in the
It
moment.
was
So I was feeling
irrational.
it was wildly irrational,
Mm-hmm.
but it was also true in what was happening to me. And so I was able to, in the moment, just be like, okay, my body's experiencing something here. This probably has a lot more to do with my childhood than it does with my marriage. And I'm going to take care of my body. And that sensation kind of lasted on and off for the rest of the day. So
Mm-hmm.
all because of a McMuffin
Mm-hmm.
I go throughout that day experiencing this physical anxiety, and I was able to just care for myself. So I do the breathing things. They don't necessarily make it go away. They might soften it a bit.
Mm-hmm.
What I also do is I imagine if I had I have 4 children. If one of my children, when they were young, were experiencing that kind of distress, what would I do? Well, I would be very gentle. I'd be caring. I'd be, come here, come give me a hug. Let me hold you. Let me help you feel better. And so
Right.
I'll put my hands over my heart and just be like, it's okay. I'm here for you. I've got you. And so the way I imagine this is I have my adult brain and my child brain, and I'm letting my adult brain kind of reach out to my child brain and say, hey, you're not alone. I am the person who can be here for you. And that's been very powerful for me.
That's really good. I like that. You're teaching me something here about the value of going into our body. And that's something I think we don't listen to or don't quite understand a lot, especially in this space.
Mhm.
How much wisdom is in our bodies. And we can really tap into that. It's like an extension. It's not just our brain that does the thinking. I'm not being scientific here, but it's our
Yeah.
entire body that experiences these things. So use your whole body to
Mhm.
help you move forward in the direction you want to go in these
Yeah.
things.
And if you do, think about the last time you experienced sexual rejection, where
Mhm.
did that happen in your body? Because I guarantee you it happened in your body somewhere. So the next time that happens, notice what's happening in my body right now. How can I take care of my body, given that my body is suffering? So I'm
Right.
experiencing this intense, unpleasant sensation. For me, it's almost always kind of along the front center line of the body. So
Uh-huh.
people feel it in the chest, in the throat, in the gut. That's where we tend to feel these things. And can you just decide that what's actually happening is I'm having a physical sensation in my body? That's the most real explanation. And we
Mhm.
could say things like, oh, I'm anxious, I'm disappointed, I'm angry. And those might all be true. But for me, what's more true is I'm experiencing a sensation in my body. And then everything else is kind of an interpretation of what's going on in my body.
That reminds me, a little while ago, Saturday morning, lying in bed, and my wife initiates sex. She wants to have sex. But I didn't. I really wasn't in the mood. But I started having a battle with myself. But I should be in the mood, right? And then all of a sudden, I just feel that, like, in that midline of the body. But I did the right move in that I stopped, I paused, I took a deep breath, like we're talking about, and I just went into my body just to listen. Like, what is this feeling? What is it trying to tell me? Why do I feel the way I do? And sometimes just giving my feelings a voice, feeling that body sensation, giving it a voice, and just uh, Tara Brock uses an acronym called RAIN: recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. I kind of ran through that in my head, and that resistance just kind of evaporated and faded away almost as quickly as it came. Kind of like a cloud, it kind of comes and it goes, at least in that instance.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
then we
absolutely.
went on and had a wonderful Saturday morning. But it was interesting that it's so easy to ignore what the body is feeling, what the body sensation is, or to shove it aside and to push it away and kind of go forward with things anyway. But when you stop and really
Yeah.
listen, there's wisdom in our emotions, and you listen to your
Mhm.
emotions and learn from it. That's a fantastic way
There's a
forward.
reason you wanted to shove it away. When we all learned about these intense sensations when we were kids, a child's nervous system actually, I mean, you have kids, you know how this works.
Uh-huh.
Like a 3-year-old who's experiencing intensity cannot handle that intensity. They have to do something about it. So they're gonna scream, break something, throw something, stomp their feet, run around, collapse to the ground. But they're reacting according to how hard the intensity is for them. When we become adults, we actually gain the ability in our nervous systems to just feel what we need to feel. So sometimes I'll actually tell people, I'm like, try feeling more and doing less. So we still have these instincts from childhood, which says when I feel this intensity in my body, I have to make it stop. I have to make it go away. So sometimes I'll ask people a question. I'm like, what are you feeling right now in your body? And they're like, oh, I have this horrible tightness in my chest. I said, if you had to feel that for half an hour, could you? And they're like,
I'd
I guess.
survive, but yeah, I could do that. Uh-huh.
Right. Because the instinct is like, no. And then but what would happen? Nothing. And it's because as adults, we have so much capacity to actually experience emotional intensity, which is also physical intensity. Because we're talking about sex, there's an interesting corollary here where our ability to make room for emotional intensity is the same as our ability to make room for sexual intensity.
Oh, I love
It's the
that. Say that
same, it's
again.
the same
That's
thing.
like truth bomb right
So
there.
our ability to make room for emotional intensity is the same as our ability to make room for sexual intensity. And so to the same extent that I have a tendency to push away my emotional intensity, I'm going to do that same thing with my sexual intensity. And I'm going to only engage in sexual encounters that have a medium to low level of intensity. Whereas if I develop that ability to handle the intensity, then I can go into more intense and more enjoyable sexual experiences.
That makes sense. And there are people that chase after more sexual novelty, but it's kind of superficial because they can't handle the intensity of someone really knowing them on a deep fundamental level.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they try to get away from it. Great. You said something earlier that stood out to me too, because we're talking about courage and all of this is kind of the heart of what we're talking about.
Hmm.
Courage, the solution to have more courage is to be more courageous, something along that. I'm
Yeah,
going to say that again,
absolutely.
James.
No, the only way to have more courage is to be more courageous. So we learn by doing. There's just no way that I can learn to be more courageous than other than just putting myself in a position to feel the things that I don't want to feel. Because courage is about being willing to feel what I don't want to feel. So let's say I know what's right to do. I mean, the stereotypical example is parents who want their children to tell the truth instead of telling lies. So children, they grow up, they start telling lies to try to get out of trouble. I didn't steal the cookies from the cookie jar, even though the cookies like literally all over their shirt, right?
Uh-huh.
And so that's, it's natural. It's part of childhood development, but it actually takes a lot of courage to when your mom's sitting there looking at you and your mom's unhappy with you, to say, oh yeah, I actually did the thing that you're mad at me about, right? And so
Yes.
that takes a lot of courage. If I can give my kid opportunities to be courageous in the tiniest of ways and then point that out, oh, you just did something courageous. I noticed that. Then they can start to feel, what does it mean to be courageous? What does it mean to do something that feels dangerous, even though it's not dangerous?
Hmm.
Because, at least if I'm not a really bad parent, my child is not actually in danger when they tell me the truth about what they did. But they feel like they're in danger. They feel like, oh, if I tell the truth, then, I'm not going to be loved anymore. I'm going to be severely punished. I mean, it's these survival instincts that come up again. But if I can help them be more courageous, I'm helping them listen more to the wisdom inside them and listen less to the fear. And that's what
Yes.
courage is.
Any examples of those that you coach or offer therapy for that come in mind, like stories about how they've really taken that step to kind of have more courage when it was hard to do?
So I worked with a man he'd recently been arrested and was going in for a job interview, and he was just so terrified. What if they find out I've been arrested? When are they going to ask? What's going to happen? He was just feeling this intense anxiety throughout his whole body. And I said, I don't know whether they really care about your arrest or not. I don't know if they're going to ask you. I really have no idea. But for your sake, I think the best thing for you to do would just to be bring it up yourself. And so that puts you in control of, I'm the one who reveals this information. And I'm not like waiting there with bated breath to see if I get caught. Instead, you're just like, hey, this is me. I got arrested. This is why. This is part of who I am. And because I'm the one in control of revealing this helps me feel more powerful and more in an agentic position. So I'm the one who makes the choice. So I thought that was a very courageous thing of him to do. And in that situation, it actually, well, he didn't get a follow on interview. So I don't know if that revealing their arrest affected that. Probably. I still think it was a really good thing for him to do, to step into that kind of courageous position of saying, I'm going to reveal this unflattering information about myself, which kind of shows a certain amount of strength in him to do that.
Mm-hmm. Good, good, good.
That's
When
another
have
one.
you asked one of your clients to be more courageous in their marriage?
So I was working with a couple and I was doing a session with just the wife. And she came into the session and she kind of started off with a pretty long list of complaints about her husband. And I listened for a while, but then I said, there's really nothing I can do about all these complaints you have. I think it would be really good for you to just confront him directly. And what I want you to do is I want you to go home and really calm yourself down and write down all the things you want to talk to him about, figure out which ones are actually the most important, and then just very calmly say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about some things, and say, this is what I see you doing, and I'd prefer you not do these things. And she actually did it that same night. So she went home, she wrote it down, and she said, hey, I'd like to talk to you. And then they had this long conversation. She said, this is mostly about parenting. She was concerned about the way he was parenting. She said, this is the way I see you treating our child. I would prefer that you treat the child differently. And I was really glad that she did that because it doesn't serve any purpose for her to come to complain to me about how the other person is parenting when she's the only one who can bring that up. She's really
It's her job to do. It's
the
her task. No one else can
it
do it
is her
for her.
task. Yeah. And it does take immense courage. She was really quite afraid of confronting him about what she was doing. She's comfortable complaining about it to a third party. But when it comes to the task of actually confronting him, that was really challenging. But she stepped in and accepted the challenge.
That's really good. So often it's easy to complain. We'd rather
So easy.
complain and we'd rather resent our spouse than actually have some courage here and step forward and do something. And there's a quote about courage I heard once that I love. It's like the difference between courage and confidence is that confidence feels good. Courage never feels good.
So true. Yeah, I think courage is accepting the reality that you're experiencing unpleasant sensations.
Mm-hmm.
Just being like, this feels unsafe, but it's not. Or I'm willing to accept whatever risk. Often in relationships, I mean, as long as you're in a relationship that doesn't involve some kind of physical violence or some kind of like extreme situation, you really are safe. Like I've always been actually safe in my marriage, but I never felt safe in my marriage. I felt like I was in danger. I felt like my survival was at risk. But it was never true. It was always this illusion. And yet most of my actions for most of my marriage were based on this illusion that I wasn't safe, as if I was a kid, living with some parent who was being mean to me.
All right. So, James, we've talked about courage and how important courage is and how important it is to put your adult mind in charge instead of your child, regressed brain in charge. And we talked about some strategies to calm yourself down and that oftentimes you're the only one that can do certain things. Instead of blaming or resenting or complaining, those are easy things to do, but to really step forward and do the hard work, that's only your task to do. It's so critical. Let's talk about some real practical things now. What are some practical strategies people can do, couples can do to improve the sexual initiation climate in their marriages?
So one thing is just pay attention to how does your partner prefer that you initiate. So a lot of people prefer to have a few hours warning. Some people might prefer to be surprised. Some people prefer a verbal initiation. Some people prefer a nonverbal initiation. It doesn't mean you have to comply with that. But if it's all the same to you, if your partner prefers to have a text, in the morning instead of just like, hey, do you want to come upstairs with me? Then go ahead and do that because it makes it easier on them. And some people hate verbal initiations, and maybe that's something they should work on. But in the meantime, it kind of makes sense to do whatever is easiest in the context of your relationship.
I love that. And I know that's only tip one of several to come, but make it easy on them. I've heard of couples where they're a reluctant initiator and they'll pick the most inopportune, worst time to initiate to guarantee they'll get a no. And then later on say, well, that one time I did initiate and you said no, but they set themselves up to have failure on purpose, right? They didn't make it
Yeah.
easy on their spouse say yes. So pick the time or pick a way, a method, make it easy on the marriage.
Mhm.
Good.
Another thing is just notice what kind of energy you're bringing into the initiation. So, I was incredibly anxious. Overall, I'm really quite an anxious person, and I'm much less so now than I was, say, 5 years ago. But I used to be so anxious about asking for sex, and that just doesn't help. It's incredibly unattractive, and it's just not a good initiation. It's worth learning to calm yourself down and saying, can I offer something good here? Can I approach this situation as if what am I offering?
I'm a catch. I'm a great lover.
Yeah. Can I approach the situation as like, I'm inviting you to have a really good experience with me. And
Mm-hmm.
this is an invitation. You're free to say no. Instead of saying, I need you to make me feel okay, I'm saying, I have a really interesting invitation for you. Would you like
That's
to
a very
accept?
different energy. Yes.
It is. It is a very different energy. And
Yeah.
in order to do that, you have to step away from the idea that you need sex in the first place, which, we all know isn't true, but it's so tempting. This idea that, that I have needs, that you're the only one who can fill it, and I'm not going to be okay unless you take care of me. That's very much kind of a child parent frame where
Yes.
I'm this little powerless person and you're this person who has all the power to make me better and you choose not to, and I'm going to die. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of the frame we have a tendency to bring to this, and it feels good in the moment, but it's incredibly toxic in the long.
Yeah, yeah. And that parent-child spirit energy, whatever you want to call it, in that relationship kills eroticism. And it sets up a
Absolutely.
marriage
Yeah.
for things done out of obligation and duty. It's not an enjoyable. Who wants to participate in that, right? It's
Sure.
not fun. There's no playfulness in it. You can't be naughty with someone that you need to also caretake. So that energy
I kind
is
of
really
especially
important.
see this. I mean, I think this is maybe especially problematic for men. I see so many men who approach their wives in a very childish way. And I think, like, especially let's say if I'm a man who grew up with some kind of doting mother, or maybe I had some sort of, intense emotional entanglement with my mom, it's really hard for me to grow out of that in marriage because it's so easy to slip into that same energy with my wife, where now I'm going to approach my wife in the same idea as, you are the woman in my life who can provide everything to me and can also choose to give me nothing. And I'm so not okay if you don't do what I need you to do. And that's like the opposite of a lover's energy.
Great. I love that. Any other practical strategies to improve sexual initiation?
Practice getting no's. So I do tell couples to ask for ridiculous things. Just be like, I need you to wear a purple unicorn onesie to bed tonight. I need you to do that. And if you don't do that, I'm not going to be okay. And just, especially if you've been in a relationship where you've done this thing where you talk about needs and you feel like your needs are not being met and you've entered into this kind of child parent framework, see if you can break out of that by making fun of it and just be like, even if you write a note and say, this is what I need from you tonight, and then just make it utterly preposterous, and so the other person can just say, yeah, I'm not going to do that, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess not, right? And so you can practice being okay with them saying no. And then, there's going to be kind of a transition to, I'm going to ask for what I actually do want. And I'm also going to be okay, even if you say no to what I actually do.
Right. In Disney's Aladdin, there's a lot of comedy in there, but there's that truth taught at the very end. The genie is free, and he asks Aladdin, "Ask for the Nile." He's like, "I wish for the Nile," and he says, "No," and it's his first time saying no in his life, and how freeing
Yeah.
that was, right? So this practice not only benefits the person asking for sex or asking for the purple unicorn onesie, but also benefits the other spouse who sometimes has a really difficult time saying no and probably has a tendency to give in saying yes when it's not in their best wisdom to do so, right? So just
Absolutely.
as much as it's a practice asking for the no, it's a good practice for the other person to give the no in the process.
And you can also say thank you for saying no. Like if you've gotten to the point where, you've noticed, okay, we have a tendency for me to not ask and you to not say no. And if you notice that you've moved past that, hey, I want you to come to bed with me. I don't want to come to bed with you. Thank you for being honest with me. Like
It,
that's an incredibly powerful thing to say.
just to be clear, we're not saying couples should be mean to each other or harsh to each other or not loving to each other here in the saying of the no's. It's not like we want people to a podcast about initiating sex equals everyone start saying no. That's not what we're talking about. But
Right.
we're
Of course
talking
not. It's just
about
that initiation would never be hard if the answer was always yes. The only
yes.
reason it's hard is because sometimes the answer is no. And if that's not ever the answer, I mean, you can't really say yes unless you can also say no. And, in these kind of relationships that we're discussing, there is this pressure that there's something wrong with saying no. And so
Mm.
that's kind of what we're trying to work out of.
Great. Great, great, great. So James, I see this a lot in the couples I coach where one is so frustrated about initiating sex, usually the higher desire spouse, like, fine then. I'm not going to initiate anymore. It's going to be your job, pointing to the lower desire spouse, whether that's his wife or her husband. You're going to do all the initiating now. That way, when you're ready to, I'll be over here ready to say yes. And they think that solves the problem. So they kind of come to that agreement in a huff, and days go by, maybe weeks go by, and there's no initiation on the other side. Or if it is, it's only a token. It's not done with enthusiasm.
Mm.
And then they're upset. Like, when I initiate all the time, we don't have sex. And then, so I stopped initiating, thinking you would initiate, and then you're not initiating. So, what's going on in couples like that participate in that dynamic?
There's so many layers to that. I think there's just so much more than an initiation problem. And so they're trying to solve kind of a deep emotional even a physical issue between them by they're rearranging the deck chairs, right? It's like, oh, we'll switch initiation to your responsibility. Well, they didn't really change anything. And so the most fundamental level, what I would say is that they're not comfortable being physically close to each other or emotionally close to each other. And so that discomfort is showing up in all these different ways. One thing that I would recommend is do something or invite your partner to do something with you that helps you both become comfortable being physically close. So David Schnarch has his exercises where you do eye gazing and you do, kind of gentle caressing, and then you do like an 8-minute hug where you just practice holding each other gently and calming yourself down while you hold your partner. I like to do with clients, I like to have them sit across from each other, look into each other's eyes and breathe together.
Sitting knee to knee or something like that, right?
Sitting knee to knee. Yeah. Sit knee to knee, and you look into each other's eyes and you breathe in sync. My wife and I do an exercise. We use an app called Breathing Zone. There's a bunch of apps that do this, but it's just a 10-minute breath timer. So it's like 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. And so we'll just lay on the bed and just breathe together. And so, the 10-second breath is very calming. So it helps your body calm down. And we just learn to be on the same bed together, awake, but without feeling anxious, which, it sounds easy, and it's just not easy. Like if you've been married for 20 years and if there's been any degree of difficulty in your marriage, I guarantee that there's so much anxiety built up in your body when you're with your partner, and you might not even be aware of it. And so that's really the first thing is, can I help my body learn to feel safe when I'm with my partner? Because if I'm going to try to step into some kind of sexual encounter with my partner, but I don't feel safe, it's just not going to go well. Safety has to be established first. And it's not like we had this idea that, oh, my partner needs to make me feel safe. And it comes back to the parent-child thing. Like when I was a kid, my mom and dad can make me feel safe. As an adult, not so much. Like especially as a man, to ask my wife to help me, the man, feel safe is just not going to work very well. She doesn't have that much safety to offer me. A lot of it has to come from me. And so if I can help my body learn to feel safe when I'm with her, then I can get closer to being able to have a better sex life with her.
One thing I've loved about this episode is how much body work is involved in all of this. It's body learning. And I think about it like we can listen to podcasts, we can read every book written about how to ride a bike, for example. But until you actually get on a bicycle, you won't know how to ride a bike. It's some things we require body learning, and overcoming fear of initiating or working through initiation struggles like what we've talked about requires body learning. You got to do it. And that requires that courage. It kind of comes back to courage, doesn't it?
It does.
Yep.
Yeah. Courage and practice or discipline, but doing something that's difficult over and over and over. So the other thing I would suggest in this situation is, you talked about bodies. So there's 2 bodies in the room, and bodies are like antennas where my body can be a very sensitive antenna to whatever's going on in my wife's body.
Like tuning forks, right? Like you hit
tuning
one,
forks, yes,
they resonate. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
They resonate, and so there's this resonance between the 2 bodies. And so, if I want to have a really good sexual experience with my wife, it depends on me allowing my body to be sensitive to what's happening in her body. Now, the problem is, if we came from a relationship where sexuality was difficult, then what I'd learned to do was to break that connection, because I didn't want to tune in to her lack of desire for me. And so I'd learned to tune out. And so now I have to step back and say, I'm going to learn to tune in, and I'm going to pay attention to what's actually happening. And if we get to a place in, kind of the sexual encounter, so say you're in some stage of foreplay or something, and I start to sense that there's a break between us, that this connection is breaking down, I need to stop and say, okay, do I want to pursue a disconnected physical sexual encounter, or do I want to come back and see how much emotional connection we can have and touch each other also, but maybe this isn't going all the way to penetration or something like that. So it depends what you want to get out of it. Do you want to just get an orgasm, or do you want to get a really high quality connection with your partner?
That's good. That's good. I love that. It's a willingness to really tune in, which takes practice. It's that D word that we hate hearing all the time. It's discipline. It's a little bit here and there, repeated over and over. Good. Where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
You can go to therapyjames.com, and I'm a therapist in California. I work online. I also offer coaching kind of throughout the world. And if you happen to live near Roseville, California, I will see you in person, which I much prefer. I really don't like working online, but I do
Great.
it. So
Very good. Thanks. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.